All right, we ready to get started? All right, so good morning. My name is David DeBrant. I'm with our Capture business development team. For those of you who were in the earlier session, I'm a counterpart to Jane, who was up here on the panel. I've also worked with Max in that area. I've been with Amazon for about 3 years, and I've been lucky enough to do Capture and procurement related jobs around the world. When I came here, like Max said earlier, it was a bit of a startup. And so one day it was federal, next day it was Australia, the next day it was Brazil, the next day it was Europe. So I've seen procurement around the world, and there's a lot of lessons learned what I'm going to talk about today about how to start talking to procurement, some of the issues you need to bring up. So we're going to dive deeper on some of the issues that we discussed earlier in the panel. So a couple things. I've got Brian Tracy with me. He's my partner in crime. Brian is a solution architect, and he is going to demo a few elements of our offering. And the reason we're going to do this is over time we have found that actually showing the console and talking about the service, we can talk about slides, we can show white papers, but actually showing the console has power. It helps people understand it. So I want to ask, how many people are with government? I know we asked this question earlier, but I want to see how many people are still. That's quite a few. And how many people are partners who are selling into government? Okay, so I think this is relevant for both sets. So for government folks, as you reach into your organization and you talk to other people about cloud, it's critically important that they understand it. One of the things I always emphasize is you want to bring together the key people early in the process. That includes procurement and legal. If they're there and they're talking early and they're listening and they understand how it works, it helps enormously as you go forward with the process. And for partners, what we're going to show you, these are some ways to help you start talking this through with your government customers as well as you're going in and talking to them, because a lot of our sales are done through the partner network. And one thing I'll just throw out there is I'll never forget sitting in a room. I was actually in Brazil with a lawyer from Brazil, sitting in the room scoffing at what we did, literally arms crossed and going, you guys just have to do it our way, our traditional IT buying method. And we sat down and we walked through the console, we showed them how it worked, showed the details, and the light bulb went off. And they went, oh, I understand why you operate this way. I understand why you're concerned about these issues. I understand why you think about this differently. And so I found it's very, very, very powerful to do that. And it turned into a conversation of how can I solve this problem rather than I'm just putting barriers up. So diving in. So the key part about procurement, I think this was touched on in the panel earlier, is there are these incredible benefits to cloud. We talk about the elasticity, we talk about the scalability, security, innovation, low cost. And what traditional procurement methodologies do, the way Max talked about for the last 30 years, how they buy cloud, tend to diminish or even eliminate those benefits. And we see it over and over again, government trying to use that traditional method, and it ends up being that the procurement stifles them and doesn't work. And so the idea is to try to avoid those as much as possible. Teresa talked yesterday, if you guys were on the keynote, about control and moving fast. And so that's a very big mind shift in terms of a procurement is how you shift to allow people have this incredible flexibility, but also you have the tools to maintain control and see it. In fact, our CISO always talks about seeing the full inventory of your IT assets. And in a traditional way, you really don't have a full inventory. It's almost impossible. When you're using the cloud, you can get that. The tools are there, you can understand it. But you can also allow your people to move quickly and fast and with incredible agility. So what we're going to do, this is a little bit of an experiment here. We're going to jump back and forth to a screen and a couple of different documents. The idea is to show you some tools, how you can talk to people about this, and to help educate people in the room as well. So bear with us while we switch back and forth a couple of times. So I'm going to let Brian do a couple of little demos, and then I'm going to weigh in from a procurement method on that. So yeah, go ahead, Carl.
Great, thanks, David. Good morning, everybody. So David talked a little bit about scalability in the cloud and how that impacts your procurement model. So this first little demo that we wanted to show you was differences in how you might scale in the cloud and what that really means in terms of an impact to your procurement model. And before we show the scalability, I also wanted to make mention of how easy it is for you to deploy resources throughout the world. If you notice right now, we're looking at my console and I'm logged in. In the upper right corner here, you see the Northern Virginia region that I'm currently provisioning resources in. If I wanted to begin provisioning resources throughout the rest of the world, or just throughout the rest of Northern America, I could simply drop this down, select the particular region that I want to deploy a workload into, and move forward and deploy those resources in those regions.
And let me jump in on that very quickly. One of the things we do see in procurements is sometimes I want my data to stay in a certain place, which is okay, you can do that. Sometimes they ask the CSP themselves to do that. And this is where the issue is. You have full control of where the data is, or your end users have full control. So procurement asking us to do that is, well, we don't control where you put your data. And this is a sort of a bit of a theme, is how much control you have over what you do. And you have to build that into your procurement. And so one of the ways we always talk about people is saying, provide the capabilities to do something. You must do it. One of the things I always say is Amazon Web Services is not a system integrator. We're not going to do all of the work. Half this, a lot of this is being done by the end user, which is really the power of it too. So it's very subtle things, but in the procurement, it's the kind of details you have to think about.
Thanks, David. So when you talk about scaling your workloads, right, it immediately means you're going to change the size of the platform that you're running your workload on, and typically that means to meet demands of your workload, whether it be the demand for your workload has spiked up and you need to increase your resources to be able to handle that new demand, or maybe the demand for the workload has dropped off, and in the cloud, you don't want to pay for resources more than what you need to run your workload. So the first demo that I wanted to show you here, and it's labeled vertical scaling, is being able to change the quote-unquote size of your machine. And that means the compute capacity and the memory of that machine. So in this example, I'm currently running a machine that has one virtual CPU and a half a gigabyte of memory, and that's common in dev and test workloads, let's say. But as you might move your workload to production, maybe I need to scale that machine up. So when I want to vertically scale that machine, meaning keeping the same machine but just increasing the compute capacity within that machine, I simply come out to the console. The machine has to be in a stop state, as you see this one is here, and I can come out here and say, hey, you know what, I want to change that instance type, and I want to go from a 1-core, half a gigabyte of RAM. Well, maybe I want to go up to something that has 32 cores and 244 gigs of RAM. And in this case, let's select that one and then hit apply. Now, I have just changed the size of that instance from what is marginally about as big, if you think of physical representation, marginally something like a Raspberry Pi, to something that ultimately is much, much larger, right, with 36 cores and 244 gigs of RAM. So we call that vertical scaling, and you can do that again as easy as turning the instance off, changing the instance type and turning it back on. You didn't have to reload your application. All the settings are as they were, and you're good to go. Vertical scaling has its limits. So as you might expect, you can only vertically scale an instance to be your largest available instance type. So what do you do when you have to scale beyond a singular instance? We call that horizontal scaling, which is infinitely more scalable because you're not limited in essentially the number of machines to scale out, as we call it. So in this example, and in order to make this example go quickly and smoothly, you'll see that right now I'm running 2 instances behind a load balancer in my horizontal scaling demo. So to give you an idea, I'm gonna increase the number of instances behind this load balancer by manually turning the dial. But you may not do that manually. You may have things like policies, like you see here, that monitor particular metrics behind your load balancer. Like if my aggregate CPU utilization goes above 75% for 300 seconds or 5 minutes, scale up, and scale up how many instances, right? So in this case, this rule says, hey, if I go above 75% CPU utilization, give me 5 more instances. And the opposite side of that fence is my CPU utilization drops below 30% in this example, scale back, right? And I'm using CPU utilization as the metric that I'm tracking, but it can be any number of other metrics to track your particular workload. So what's appropriate for your workload? In this case, I'm not going to use the auto scaling policies, and I'm going to say, hey, you know, instead of running 2 instances, I want to run 20 instances. Excuse me. And what I've done there is say, hey, you know, give me 20 instances. So behind the scenes here, and if I go to the activity history, in a few moments, you'll start to see additional new servers that are going to be launched and automatically placed behind my load balancer. And pretty soon here, there'll be 18 additional instances. If I come out here to my instance list where you saw the original 3, you're going to start to see some additional instances. So you'll see my vertical scaling, then you'll see my 2 horizontal scalings, and then you'll essentially see these 18 other instances beginning to spin themselves up. They'll also label themselves once they've passed a health check, and they'll automatically be added behind my load balancer. So that's why procurement within the cloud is a very different model, right? You match your compute capacity to meet your workload demands, and it's very, very easy to scale either vertically or horizontally to give you the compute capacity that you need.
And so switching over to procurement from that, so you see that. I've actually recently talked to a customer outside the US who said, we want every time there's an instance change or any time an instance is added, we want to go through a process. Add this, you know, make sure the governance model works, a document that's filled out, whatever it is. And if you think about what he just did in, 2 minutes? Yeah. To go through a process each time you want to do that, it's untenable. And people try to set up procurements. It's still happening, but people are trying to set up procurements to do it that way. So this goes back to some of the discussions earlier around a SKU list, trying to pick off a SKU list, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, but trying to build a contract where you're building, you know, one at a time, thinking about it as hardware. That kind of flexibility has to be built in. And Karen Petraska, who was up here earlier on the panel from NASA, talked about how they've set up a contract where instead of buying offline items, they are buying they have buckets, and they allow the end users the flexibility to operate this way, what they need to do. Do I need to auto scale up? Do I need to try a different instance type? Do I need to vertically scale, horizontally scale, whatever it is? It gives them the flexibility to run their application the way they need to run their application. So it's an important part of a procurement. So I've learned that just seeing this, and if you're talking to a procurement officer or a legal person, showing this is not hard to learn. I was a history major in college, and I can walk through this. And if you show this, and people get a grasp of it. So that's sort of the idea, is to take this lesson and try to go in and go from there. All right. Oh, Carl, do you want to switch back? Thanks. Okay, so the next area is around innovation. Again, if you were here in the earlier session, this was touched on a couple of times. We are constantly adding service feature and new services to AWS. Last year we did 722 feature and service upgrades. This year we're on pace. I think in April we did almost 100. So it is a constantly changing set of services, upgrades, new things, better versions. Some instance type will be replaced by another instance type that is more powerful at a lower cost. So it's an ever-changing thing. We run into procurements. Actually, why don't you show real quickly the what's new page?
Sure.
Carl, do you want to switch back real fast?
And just to clarify, through April 30th, we've done 313 new features and capabilities.
Oh, it's 313.
313.
Oh,
Through
okay.
April 30th.
My fault.
No problem.
Okay, so we just want, again, this is a way to demo this and show this, is to show people the scale and the scope of the change. So why don't you scroll down just a little bit?
So the URL, in case you can't see it, is just aws.amazon.com/new. And on this page, what you'll see is it runs, there's the most recent announcements here at the top. And then here, if I can shrink that down a little bit so you can see more. And then what you'll see is then we go what's new by category. So we're showing you all the latest new features and capabilities that we've rolled out by category in case you want to see it and parse it out that way.
So where this comes in procurement, we run into this regularly, is we'd like to see any service change has to be approved by us before it can be used. So Governments ask for us to do that. And for us to provide with this scale and this number is administratively impossible. We're not going to do it. And for a partner, it's the same thing. And even for an end user, a customer in the government, to try to do this and keep up with this, all you're doing is slowing down the adoption by your end users that are out there. And end users out there will say, I want to use this new feature. Well, it hasn't been approved yet. Well, how do I get to that? So it's one of these things where being careful about material change, allowing changes to the contract to occur. The best ones we've seen have allowed it to happen automatically. They're okay with it. It's built into the RFP, it's built into the contract where new features and services can be added and used. And we'll talk about this in a little bit, but there are ways to control what you use and how you use it. Again, but that's up to the end user, and we'll talk about the governance model in a little bit. Okay, Carl, do you want to switch back? Thanks. Okay, so utility pricing. This is touched on again a little bit too. You don't know how much you're going to spend on the cloud right away. So there's no upfront or fixed price that you're going to put in there and say, I'm going to spend X amount in a month or a year. So what happens is if you try to do a fixed price or a single price, it can add, ultimately you're taking away the benefit of the lower prices that we're adding and the granularity and the flexibility you have to architect in the most efficient way you can, best value as we talk about it. So real quick, Carl, if you want to switch back, we're going to show the spreadsheet. So I want to give you an idea, and this is something you can show to people when you're talking. If you want to just scroll down a little bit. This is a spreadsheet of one region of AWS. This is US East. And we're at 98 line items. It goes down to about 10,000 line items. And so we have contracts that ask for a line item list of all of the SKUs that AWS has. And then they want to buy off this list, like they're buying devices, something like that. And trying to buy off something like this with all the granularity really doesn't work. The best contracts we've seen actually will buy directly from our console or even another cloud provider console, and then build controls around using the end console as the source. So showing that spreadsheet, I think has been very effective to sort of walk through it with a pricing person or a contracts person so they understand the granularity. Because I think folks have an idea of clouds. Ultimately, you're helping define what cloud is here too, because cloud has a lot of definitions to people. And if you show these things, it becomes a lot clearer is what I found. Carl, do you want to switch back? Okay, so from a procurement perspective, we have submitted the whole price list on a procurement, and that's there, and we've seen partners do the same thing. But ultimately, I think what we recommend is perhaps the most efficient way to do it, and for those of you in here earlier, Jane mentioned this, is a single line item for AWS. And then you start putting those in buckets, and you control the buckets because there's so much to use across the line. I'm actually working on a procurement right now, I won't say where, but they want to boil down compute, all of our compute, and that's probably 9,000 line items, down to a single number. They want one number for compute, per this, one number it has to be bid. And so what they've done is they've eliminated almost all the benefits of the cloud, trying to measure how does a vendor put all of our stuff into one number. That's what we're trying to do ahead of time, is to understand this, and that's the kind of conversation we need to have ahead of time, even 6 months or 9 months ahead of time as people are preparing for procurement. Okay, so security. We have talked about security in our shared responsibility model. Just to give you guys an overview of what that is, if you're not familiar, we provide security of the cloud. So we're working from literally the fences outside the data centers, access to the data centers, the building themselves, up to, at least on the compute side, up to the hypervisor. Above that, which is here, you provide the security in the cloud. You, the end user, are responsible for that security. So Brian's going to do a quick demo of a couple things around security. I think will give you a clear idea to understand the responsibility and where the responsibilities break down.
So thanks, David. So just to be clear, we could literally spend an entire week talking about security in AWS and best practices for design patterns and anti-patterns that you want to stay away from. I won't torture you with that today. What I've chosen to do here is I've created a couple of RDS databases, which is our managed database service that I will be talking about this afternoon. And I've labeled them demo best practices and demo everything wrong, just so it was blatantly obvious when I was showing you some of these best practices. The first thing that I wanted to point out was if we look up here, or actually scroll down here, you'll be able to see it just as easily. I have my database is set in a VPC. They're secured by security groups. In this case, I've named this one my unsecured security group, and I'm about to show you why. Security groups within AWS are stateful firewalls that allow you to control source, destination, and protocol activity. And then I named this my unsecured security group because if we click into that security group, you'll see that essentially I've got 3306, which is the port for MySQL, open to the entire internet. That is a worst practice, not a best practice, just to be clear. Please do not do this in real life. But just to give you an example, AWS gives you the tools and empowers you with the capabilities to be able to completely control your environment. This is my pitch for working with somebody like myself who's your solutions architect. We can do things like help architect your workloads. We can point out potential issues with your security model that you've employed. We're happy to sit and do reviews of your workloads and things of that nature to prevent you from doing things just like that, right? Moving back to the database, some other things that I'm doing wrong in this database. This is not necessarily wrong, the publicly accessible switch. All that really means is, do I want my database to be accessible outside of my VPC or my virtual private cloud? It doesn't mean, hey, it's open to the entire public. But what it does mean is, if I'm using a properly configured security group, I can be able to hit this database from outside of AWS with my appropriate tools, like MySQL Workbench or whatever, or from your on-prem. And I'll show you that example when we switch to the best practice database. As we move down, you'll see that I'm not running this database in multi-AZ. Multi-AZ is a highly available configuration pattern that allows you to have a primary and a failover database for providing a higher level of availability to your applications and users. I've disabled automated backups, not a good idea. I've told AWS, don't do my minor upgrades for me on the database stack. You know, I'll deal with that when I need to deal with it. And then disabled that backup window as well. So please don't walk away with this one thinking, oh yeah, it's okay to do some of that stuff. You do have a lot of control and autonomy in this, but what I wanted to show you was how you might set up your database in a more best practice scenario. So in this case, I've got a security group. I've left this publicly accessible, but wanted to point out, if we go look at this security group is locked down to my particular IP range. So even though, and you'll see that here, so even though I've got the flag set to allow my database to be publicly accessible, my security group controls my ingress to that database. It's a firewall that says, hey, I'm only going to allow communication on 3306 from 72.21.198.68. And so that's a best pattern, best practice in terms of access there. And then scrolling down, I've done things like turn on encryption on the database. I've done things like use multi-AZ so that I do have a primary and a failover node. So if there's a problem with my primary database node, the RDS Managed Database Service will automatically flip my applications and users over to the standby node. And I've done things like enable automated backups and agree to things like, yes, apply minor patches to my database because those patches could be security patches and may be important to my environment. Did I cover it, David?
Yeah, no, that's perfect. So transferring this over to a procurement discussion is, this is the control that the end user or the partner has using the AWS offerings. So when I read RFPs, what I'll look for is the language around that. We'll sometimes see Amazon must provide data backup and data recovery. Well, that's up to the end user how you set that up and how you do it. So for Amazon to sign up, that's the end piece. Amazon must encrypt all my data. Again, it's up to you to encrypt the data. We give you the best practices and the tools to do it. If you want to take your keys and you want to put your keys somewhere else, that's totally fine. So it's, again, a shift in thinking around how you do a procurement. And it's asking for the capabilities to do these things, or asking a partner to do these things for you. But to ask Amazon as a commercial provider of cloud to make sure all these things happen, which happened in a traditional managed service environment, really goes against the whole tenet of the cloud, the control piece that we talked about earlier. Okay, so one of the key areas, and this relates, sure.
You guys were at the US East. If we were using the GovCloud, would that look any different?
GovCloud is a region just like ours, except it's ITAR compliant. So, but you do need permissions to access it, which is a separate discussion.
Yeah, yeah. So you don't see the drop down for GovCloud in that list because it's a completely autonomous operating region for obvious reasons. The console itself looks a little bit different because it doesn't have the full breadth of services, because as we roll new services out, they take time to get vetted and approved for use in that GovCloud region. But essentially, everything else operates and functions the same way.
You said you had a 9,000 line item procurement. Do you have anything in DoD that does that? Do you have a procurement in DoD that we can leverage?
Let me talk to my DoD folks afterward. I know there's some different areas there, but I think it's one of those kind of complex questions, who and when people can use it. So I think there are methods to do it, but why don't we talk afterward and we can try to figure out the right place. I've been very internationally focused lately, so I've lost track of, honestly, some of the DoD things, what's going on there. That's the interesting part about getting into a big company. You start getting focused. So what we're going to talk about right now is governance. And again, this is sort of following the theme is, we get requests and procurements to say, you make sure these things happen, and make sure this thing works this way, or make sure these people don't have access. And again, it's the same theme. You have the tools and the capabilities to do this. So Brian is going to quickly demo, was it CloudFormation, correct?
CloudFormation.
It's just one tool that's available that will allow you to control how things, but it shows the controls on your side.
So CloudFormation is a really neat capability within AWS. You can think of it as infrastructure as code. So while earlier I was doing things like provisioning servers by working within the console and turning things up and down and changing security groups and things of that nature in RDS, you can do all of that through a CloudFormation script. And what's really nice about that, and from a governance perspective, is you can write those scripts and have those blessed within your organization in terms of, this is the way we want to provision this particular environment or this particular set of security groups or users or so on and so forth. And then people can use those stacks and have all of this automation done for them. So in this example, I'm just going to reach out and grab a stack that I use for when I teach a CJIS, Criminal Justice Information Systems workshop, and we're going to let this thing provision, and then after it starts, we're going to talk about some of the things some of the resources that this stack is actually creating on my behalf. So we're just going to call this Summit Demo, let's say. You can see I've typed that before. They're easily parameterizable, so you get to create the parameters that you want this stack to allow users to interact with and change potential settings on. In this case, I've said, hey, you have to pick one of these instances, and it can only be one of these instances. So I don't want my users spinning up 36 cores and 244 gigs of RAM in this case, as an example. And I'm just going to pick one of those. I'm going to pick an appropriate key pair and tell it where to launch within my environment, and then do a couple review screens here. This is the Are You Sure screen. And now this is going to begin provisioning the resources that this template has told it to do. I won't torture you with a lot of JSON script because this isn't really a very technical track, but this is what the code looks like behind the scenes for what it's going to go ahead and provision. JSON is a standard open language. And we make great use of it within the AWS environment. If I switch back over to events, what you're going to start seeing is, and I'll go from the bottom because it's bottom up, I'm creating things like a security group here. I'm creating things like EC2 security groups. Those are the security groups that you just saw me use on my RDS database. If I hit refresh here, you'll see it provisioning some other stuff. I'm creating an IAM role. This is an identity and access management role. This is, again, another security element that allows me to grant a certain set of permissions to other users or potentially other resources within AWS. And so what I mean by that, and in this particular one, I'm creating a role that allows my EC2 instance to reach into my S3 service to pull some of my scripts out to the EC2 instance. In this one here, I'm allowing the execution of a Lambda script. I've created a Lambda function, so if you're familiar with our AWS Lambda service, it's serverless compute, and I've gone ahead and done that here. And then finally, this thing will end up creating an EC2 instance, pulling those predefined Python scripts that I've written and put in an S3 bucket, and these roles will allow my EC2 instance to reach into my S3 bucket, pull those Python scripts across, so when I want to actually provision users in my environment, I can run those Python scripts.
Yep. So ultimately, you control how your users are using AWS and what they can do and what they can't do. And that's just one tool of a number of tools that allow you to do that. There's auditing capabilities, there's analysis, there's monitoring. So ultimately, again, it provides you the power to do that. And again, from a procurement perspective, we get the question, can you do these things for me? And ultimately, that's the beauty of the cloud, is they provide you that incredible flexibility to do that yourself. Carl, if you want to switch back, please. Did I miss one? Let me see. Okay. So sort of the final area we'll dive into, and I want to make sure I leave time for questions, is around terms and conditions. And it's one of the areas that we also want to discuss early. This is where that conversation I talked about earlier, meeting with legal and demoing the console and showing how this operates. And then you sit down and say, this is why we operate this way from a legal perspective in the terms and conditions. And when we can explain the why we operate this way and why it's set up this way, typically it makes more sense and people understand it. So I'll just hit a couple of them just for time, but I'm happy to talk about all of them afterward. So audits. We get asked questions about, we'd like to audit the data center. Come in and do that. Now, if you think about it, we have 1 million active customers. And if we had allowed every person to audit the data center, it gets very messy. Would you like other people walking by the machines as well? Also, security is job zero for us. It is the top thing. And to allow access to our data centers and show where they are, something, I don't know where the data centers are. I don't think Brian knows either. It is absolutely tight here. So it's one of the things that we talk about. Let me see. Fixed service terms and pricing. We talked about that as well earlier. Fixed pricing is, Amazon's changing its pricing. Its pricing changes on a regular basis. That can be a challenge. Service level agreements. Because you have so much control about how you operate in the cloud and what you do, in a sense, we build it for high availability architectures, but you build your high availability architectures. In theory, if you wanted to build an application that ran in all 12 regions, I mean, that SLA, I don't even know what that SLA would be, but it'd be a pretty high SLA, but you create that yourself. So our SLAs are at the product level for our 5 core products, but it's not an SLA across the entire AWS offering because you create that and set yourself. So it's one of those details in a procurement, is understanding that as you go in and build a procurement going forward. So to kind of wrap this up, key stakeholders. Let me finish and I'll come around. Key stakeholders. We have found that if you go in and start talking to maybe a business lead in an agency, or maybe it's the IT shop, that's great. But we tell them the first time I walk in there, is procurement, is legal, is finance involved? And more often than not, no, not initially. Oh, we'll write the RFP specs and then we'll throw it over to procurement and then they'll take care of it and rewrite it from there. We found that procurement needs to have a seat at the table early. They need to go through these kind of demos. They need to understand it. Setting up time to do that will help them, instead of going, I'm going to go my traditional method, I'm going to go help solve this problem because I understand there's a different approach to this. So what we, over time, what we recommend is all different groups within the organization need to be represented at the table as this is developed. And the best cloud procurements have these people there, and with understanding of how it works from their perspective really helps to create the ideal RFP or the ideal contract in the end. So next steps we talked about, so obviously evangelize within your organization, talk to the different folks, get them involved. Second is partners. Partners are critical to how we operate. I know there's partners in this room, and I hope some of these things you can use as you're having your discussions. And obviously, we talked about this earlier in the panel too, is engaging with the industry, engaging with Amazon. One thing I always recommend to anybody I talk to is there's nothing wrong with a draft RFP or a draft ITQ, whatever you want to call it. Send it out to industry, let them provide feedback, because there are things that wouldn't even be on your mind or a thought that would end up being, could be a potential issue or something that will reduce the benefits of the cloud. And it may be a simple fix for you to do. So we recommend that kind of approach. So, but engaging early, having conversations across the line with partners, Amazon, other CSPs, whatever, really does help. Trying to do this behind closed doors typically stifles, or you end up with a poor procurement. And I actually was in Colombia. They built a procurement in Colombia. And they did it behind closed doors the first time, and they realized they had made some mistakes, and it was a 2-year contract, so they were stuck with this contract. They are now doing all of these steps, very detailed conversations, learning how to do this in the right way based on their lessons learned. And I guess I'll leave it on this. Our head of AWS, Andy Jassy, always talks about there's a journey to the cloud. I think there's also a journey to procurement, that it's iterative. You don't want to start with a big bang 5-year contract. Karen talked earlier about very small, light procurements to test and learn how to do this. And if you do that, typically, then you're ready to do larger procurement going forward. So be iterative about it and be flexible about it. I think that's it.
This gentleman had a question.
Okay, yeah, I'll open the floor up to questions. So why don't you go to the microphone here if you want, and so the rest of the crowd can hear.
Quick question while he's coming up. These slides, I may have missed it, and if I did, I apologize. There's so many sessions here. How does one get a set of these slides? Are they going to be made available?
Yes, we'll have a single site where we post them all, and there'll be an email that will go out, and then they'll be broken up by session so you can see the slides. And if you want to contact me afterward, I'm happy to talk directly about it.
In addition to that, everything's being videotaped, and we post all of these up on we have a YouTube channel for AWS, and they'll all be out there on YouTube as well.
Could you go back 3 slides?
A couple days.
That's it. The background checks.
Yep.
That's a thing I can't get around. So do you do that?
We have, that's part of the security model is we have an array of regimes and accreditations that we work with, and we background check our data center and our service team staff. The question is that people come in with unique background check terms.
No, just NACI.
I'm sorry?
Just NACI.
NACI.
National Agency Check.
Okay, well, I'm not familiar with NACI.
We
so.
do background checks. I mean, I got background check before I got
Yeah,
hired.
so
They still hired me.
but yeah, we can check on the specifics of that. But the point of it is governments sometimes come in with they have their own background check that does the exact same thing as one of our accreditations or our background check regimes, and there's no point in replicating, or we can't go off and start agreeing to every single one. I don't know about NACI. We can talk about that afterward. I'm sorry?
It's a real standard thing.
Okay, well, we may have it. I just don't know. So.
We do background checks. Sir, what I was going to clarify was, are you speaking specifically around CGIS workloads or
No,
just in general?
I'm DOD.
Yeah,
Okay.
Yeah, we do background checks.
And the second question is on scaling. I work for the Army. We have 5 large ERP systems, one of which, 3 of them are SAP, one of which is the largest SAP implementation in the world, 127,000 users. The question is, can you handle a workload like that?
Absolutely. So we're running some of the largest ERP implementations around the world. We have an ability within AWS to essentially scale infinitely, or just about infinitely, and we can absolutely handle those workloads. In fact, we've handled workloads in virtually every particular vertical use case that you can think of, and we're running those around the continent, or around the world.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Can you go to the mic? It's a little difficult to hear.
Thanks for all the great information. I was wondering, would it be possible for AWS to share some kind of a prescriptive model? So the high-level guidelines are really good, they're helpful, but whoever is doing it very well, Australia, Colombia, doesn't matter. If you could share the non-confidential information,
Yep.
right? as a prescriptive model so that an agency can look at it and say, okay, here is a model, let's tweak it so that it works for us, right?
Absolutely.
So that would be really helpful.
Yeah, so the first place I'd guide you to is we have a very, very in-depth white paper. And the team, our capture team, put it together based on lessons learned around the world. That is very granular. It's prescriptive. It's a roadmap. Here are the things you need to think about, why you need to think about them. Here's best practices that different governments have done. And here's even the language they used for this specific topic area. And so that is about a 40-page deep dive document. I mean, it's a deep read, and we typically try to, and that's publicly available. We typically hand it out as people get very serious about procurement. We also do have some higher level. I mean, there's obviously slides, but we have documents as well. Amazon loves a white paper. We have some very high level documents that are better for sort of getting started, 3 or 4 pages on sort of the top 10 things that are available. And then, the other thing I find too is it's really useful to, when you get serious, is to really set some time apart. I've done all-day sessions with government, a couple of procurement people, legal, and business people in a room. We walk through these, we walk through the console, and it turns into a very, very deep conversation on both sides as a learning capability. Trying to do that in 1 hour, you start scratching the surface. So you've got to invest some time up front, but it saves you really a lot of agony towards the other side of it. So, any other questions? Okay, well, I'm up here if anybody has questions. Brian's up here obviously as well. And thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.